There are problems that affect so many, and yet so few talk about them, which is why Rabbi Efrem Goldberg and Moshe Yachnes bring you Out of the Shadows, a Jewish approach to mental health. Rabbi Goldberg and Moshe speak to leaders in the field and discuss contemporary challenges to help us better understand mental health and those who are struggling with it. This month's topic, Psychedelic Assisted Therapy. On this episode, we are joined by Dr. Jacob Freedman, a board-certified psychiatrist practicing medicine in both Massachusetts and the state of Israel, where he maintains a private practice in Jerusalem. And Ari D, a humble individual who shares his story of significant traumas, the consequences of those traumas that he lived with, and his ongoing journey of healing and self-discovery. Throughout his journey, Ari has experienced many different modalities of therapy, and psychedelic therapy and its tools have positively impacted his mental health. There are sensitive parts to his story, and if anyone is interested to learn more, Ari is available to share with those who are seeking healing of their own. We hope you find this episode meaningful and helpful, and be sure to check out the show notes for further resources.
We are excited to be back with the next episode of Out of the Shadows. Sorry it's taken us a little while, but we are really committed to be able to consistently address this topic and meet our goal, which is to take away the stigma from mental health issues and to empower people that we love to come out of the shadows. And this episode is a little bit of a controversial topic, Moshe, right? I didn't know much about it at all, but you did, and might even take some heat for it, the topic of psychedelics. So why is that a controversial area in mental health?
Absolutely. It's great. First of all, it is great to be back, and always a pleasure getting to work with you and see you again. Psychedelic psychotherapy is controversial, I think, because it's unknown. I think anything that's unknown, and when there's a lack of clarity, people like to draw conclusions and make assumptions. And I think although it's been around for a long time, and we'll learn more about it as we discuss it, but it's an innovative approach to an alternative approach, perhaps, to failed attempts with the traditional modalities of treatment. And obviously, there's a lot of dangers when it comes to drug use, any type of medication, specifically psychedelics, if it's unguided and if it's not used in the context of a real therapeutic environment. And I will just add that as we have this conversation and we continue the dialogue, one should not take a soundbite and misrepresent or quote, because it's really the goal of this conversation is really to launch a deeper conversation, is to have a conversation and to stimulate thought and dialogue around mental health issues across the board. It's presumptuous to assume that we're going to resolve an issue, we're going to clarify a modality of treatment on a show like this or in a conversation with one or two professionals. But it's really, if you're intrigued by it, if you are unsuccessful in your attempt to find the happiness, stability, functionality, then it may be worth something exploring. And that's really the goal of the conversation, like all of our topics, to continue to learn together, to explore together, and hopefully to heal together.
It's such an important point you made, right? Because the fact that we are trying to discuss this on an episode of Out of the Shadows doesn't mean that you or I, we fully endorse psychedelics, certainly not in a recreational setting, certainly not unsupervised and dangerous. It also means we don't reject it wholesale. We're trying to learn and grow and be open-minded and intellectually honest about the treatment options that are out there. And we encourage you to do the same. So if there are people in your family, you yourself, people you know, learn more about it, but do it in responsible, do it in a setting which is safe, an environment which is safe. And certainly we are not endorsing any recreational use of any of the parallels to these psychedelic drugs that are being used. And I learned an enormous amount. And I think that people who have an open mind and are looking to learn and still to fall within both a halachic framework and a proper medical framework and a therapeutic setting, we're looking to use whatever tools Hashem has gifted in our generation as we continue to reveal and advance and learn about more options to help people. There are people, as we'll talk about on this episode, there are people finding enormous help in this, in the right setting and from the right person. We're really excited to bring this conversation to you. We're excited to continue this conversation and really educate ourselves and understand this topic with someone who's well positioned to teach us and talk to us. Dr. Jacob Freedman, private practice psychiatrist out of Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, out of Israel, and as well still out of Massachusetts, still practicing out of the great state of Massachusetts.
I don't know if it's as great as it once was back in the time of Paul Revere, but from time to time I try and help folks in Boston.
Got it. Well, we appreciate very much your coming out of the shadows and helping us try to take the stigma away from the conversations in mental health. And one of the hottest conversations in mental health is this topic of psychedelics. So from a professional standpoint, a psychiatry standpoint, many people are very familiar with it. I'm sure tuning in eager to hear what sort of the establishment, I don't know that we represent the establishment, have to say, but many are not as familiar. To those who are not as familiar, talk to us about psychedelics.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is just the two of you are doing tremendous service to our community by having these discussions. So a big yasher koach. Harav, I know about all the fantastic things you do in the community. I know about the patients that you support in their treatment, the families that you support who are supporting their loved ones going through the treatment process. You and I do have a beef, though, because you stole Donnie Silverstein from me. He happens to be a very dear friend of mine, and you commandeered him and moved him down to help the community, which is a big loss for me, but big gain for you guys. And Reb Moshe, I know you'll benefit from having him as a colleague and the tremendous work that you're doing out there as well. I should just start off by saying that psychedelics are something that scared psychiatrists for a very, very long time, because traditionally we've associated psychedelic drugs with people developing very concerning psychiatric symptoms. While they were explored as treatment agents back in as early as the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we generally have associated psychedelic drugs, whether psilocybin, magic mushrooms, ecstasy, MDMA, or LSD, with our patients developing psychotic breaks. If you had asked me to give this talk 10 years ago, I would have said, y'all are crazy, no way in heck I'm going to go ahead and get out there and even have a discussion. Usser. If you had asked me about it 2 years ago, I would have said, absolutely not. Let's see where the research takes us in 5 years. But here we are now, and my response is psychedelics are very, very dangerous to be used recreationally. These are powerful substances that have serious risks associated with them. But under the right circumstances, I think these can be life-saving treatments for patients who have specific issues that they're dealing with, and when they receive treatment in a safe and standardized treatment environment. What are psychedelics? Maybe that's a really important question we should be asking, because
maybe Dr. Freedman, if you could
word.
outline, correct, if you can outline the actual, drugs that we're referring to, and of course, just to, reinforce our agenda here is to have the conversation, to launch the dialogue, to encourage people to do the research and engage in a modality that perhaps can be helpful, perhaps can be detrimental, but it's really about having the conversation and to come out of the shadows, like we always discuss.
The list you mentioned of the examples of psychedelics were lists that, like, I grew up saying, stay as far away as you can. Those were called hardcore drugs. Those were called dangerous drugs. Those were the things that, healthy, normal, well-balanced people don't go near. And yet you've listed them under the umbrella or the title of psychedelics. So yeah, talk to us more about it.
Okay, so psychedelics, again, it's a Greek word, and basically we're talking about drugs that expand consciousness. According to some definitions, the classic psychedelics all work through the serotonin 2A receptor, and we're talking about things that change the way that we perceive reality, in addition to changing perhaps things that we see, seeing things that other people can't see, and change the things that we're hearing, perhaps hearing things that other people aren't hearing. We're talking about things that change perception in terms of the space-time continuum and the way that we understand it, and powerful substances that allow people to delve deep within themselves and to think about a lot of things that maybe they haven't thought of in a very long time. Here's a really important number or two. Approximately 10 million people have experimented with psychedelics that are living. We're talking about 30 million people, according to some estimates, that have done them over the history of mankind. So a lot of people have done this stuff. If we want to look at the timeline, in prehistoric times, presumably people were using this, according to Wikipedia, in cave paintings. What do I know about that? I don't know too much, I wasn't around. But in 1912, MDMA was first synthesized. That's what's often called ecstasy. In 1938, LSD was first synthesized. That's called acid. in the 50s and 60s, this was used and abused by various Harvard professors and gurus and members of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. And then in 1971, the war on drugs basically said, usser, 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 we're done with this stuff. You're not allowed to use it. In 1986, the first big organization studying what psychedelic drugs can do in a beneficial fashion for mankind was created, and that's called MAPS. MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So these are guys, proper scientists, one of whom many folks might have heard of, named Dr. Gabor Mate, who are studying how psychedelic drugs can help people dealing with medical conditions, specifically with mental illness. By 2006, there were already proper studies done for ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic drug, and for psilocybin, which is the active compound in magic mushrooms, studying treatment-resistant depression. And in 2006, so almost 20 years ago, we were already seeing as a field that there was a role for these drugs with specific patients in specific circumstances. In 2019, MDMA, which is known to many people as a club drug called ecstasy or Molly, was already being used for compassionate use in PTSD patients, specifically veterans. So now in 2023, we're seeing multiple countries. Australia is the most recent one, previously Israel, also America and Canada, where MDMA is used for people with severe PTSD. Psilocybin is, dozens of studies are looking into what mushrooms can do for patients with OCD, for patients with treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, studies of ayahuasca, which is another psychedelic, for substance use, ibogaine, which is another substance used to treat substance use. We're talking also about ketamine, which used to be used as a horse tranquilizer and was called Special K when we were kids, and folks who were struggling would try and buy it off the streets. But now it has an FDA approval for patients with treatment-resistant depression, for OCD, and for PTSD. And under the right circumstances, for the right patients, people are getting better. And it's remarkable because these are people who are otherwise stuck in the worst possible way. So things are changing. The field of psychiatry is very, very excited about this, albeit very cautious for good reason.
And is it mainstream now? Would you say somebody who's a young person or any age who's in medical school now and studying to be a psychiatrist today, or are we very close to it being incorporated into the curriculum of up-and-coming psychiatry of medical students? Is it mainstream? Are these dispensed through pharmacies?
Great question. So the biggest journal, Der Heiliger New England Journal of Medicine, is publishing studies of psychedelic drug treatment for mental illness. So that is even better than Mishpacha magazine or Hamodia. By definition, people are reading about this in medical school. There was a big study recently that came out about ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, shock therapy. Think One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is the most effective treatment in the history of psychiatry. In some patient populations, 90% efficacy for treatment-resistant depression. And ketamine was shown to be more effective for treatment-resistant depression in certain subgroups, specifically younger people with treatment-resistant depression. So the fact that this data is suggesting a usefulness, and not just a usefulness, but a necessity in certain situations with patients who are really, really struggling, means that this is a life-saving treatment. And medical school is all about learning life-saving treatments and, frankly, how we can implement them. So when you have FDA approval for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression, meaning patients who haven't gotten better with multiple antidepressants and therapy and the standard things out there, when you have FDA approval for the treatment of PTSD and OCD with ketamine, when it's given in a clinic by a doctor under specific monitoring protocols, this is, of course, being studied in medical school. And I think, frankly, it's a very exciting topic. because this is where the future is headed in psychiatry. The majority of new and exciting things that are being published have to do with psychedelics. The biggest universities in America, whether it's Stanford, whether it's the University of California, whether it's Hopkins or Harvard Medical School, are studying psychedelics in treatment-resistant patients. And one very exciting thing to note is that we're not just learning about how to help patients when we study psychedelics, we're learning how the brain works, because these are compounds that are tremendously powerful. And when we watch them work, we learn about how the brain is functioning when things are going well, and how the brain is functioning when things are not going well. And that is very exciting. It's not just
Take,
these drugs that, sorry, go ahead. I'm just
yeah, no, I was
excited
just gonna,
because this is an
as an
exciting topic.
example, no, I mean, first of all, thank you. There was a tremendously clear overview of the history and where we're at currently. But just as an example, a simple example, take trauma as a clinical presentation, where a person can be stuck physiologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically. The trauma manifests itself in multiple dimensions. And we know that a person's reaction to trauma is very often disinhibited by their natural defense mechanism. By incorporating psychedelic psychotherapy, a person can, well, essentially what they do is they're blocking the ego, they're blocking that defense mechanism, allowing them to engage in the depth of that trauma work. And I know I don't want to oversimplify it. I know that's a very complex example.
Or over complexify it.
Correct. I mean, it's it's a very specific example, but for somebody who has been unsuccessful in traditional trauma treatments, by incorporating psychedelic psychotherapy, and I'm very critical in saying the word psychedelic psychotherapy because it does need to be folded into a curriculum, into some type of medically guided process. Very often, it could allow a person to engage into some of that deep trauma, PTSD experiences and process it. So there's a medical component to it, and then there's the clinical therapeutic component to it. Dr. Freedman, can you talk a little bit more about the interplay between both of those?
Absolutely. I'm first going to fight you for a bit, because when
Okay.
you say there's a medical component and there's a therapeutic component, therapy is medicine, which is why you have to be a licensed clinician who has spent hours upon hours, years upon years, seeing patients under the direct supervision of an expert clinician in order to properly heal your patients. So therapy is medicine. We also know that just as medications will change brain function, therapy will change brain function. So that's clearly medicine. Just as exercise is medicine, just as healthy diet is medicine, just as Ruchnius is medicine because it changes brain function, therapy is absolutely medicine. So I'll just fight you on that for 1 sec,
Good.
but I'm sure we're in
Good point.
agreement.
Yes.
No fight.
Okay. Because frankly, you're a professional, which is why you do solid work out there, Rav Moshe.
Thank you.
How does it work? Here's the question. How do psychedelic drugs work? There's basically two Venn diagram overlapping things happening. Number one is what you bring up. This treatment, whether it's with psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, ketamine, facilitates a very deep and relaxed state. It facilitates access to feelings on the inside. And specifically, MDMA is also called an empathogen, meaning that it allows a person to connect better with other people and with themselves. So these substances allow people to connect with a very deep part of themselves that they don't always have access to, which essentially can facilitate a very deep psychotherapeutic process. There's an idea that ibogaine, which is ibogaine is a West African shrub that's been used forever to allow people to enter into a deep psychedelic state, and it's used in traditional indigenous healing rituals to facilitate a spiritual state that allows individuals to correct whatever sort of averas they did somewhere in West Africa. Now, for us, we would say it allows a person to connect with the things deep inside of their kishkas. And as part of that, you can undergo a guided, very spiritual, meditative process to understand what are those thoughts and feelings that otherwise might be too painful to talk about, might be too embarrassing to talk about, or might just be buried so deeply that I don't even know they're there. So, therapy associated with psychedelics allows a person to access a very deep place. Ibogaine therapy is called a decade of therapy in one use. Now, I think that might be just kind of an exciting terminology for it, but people who have done proper psychedelic assisted therapy and clinicians who are trained, and it's a specific training in this, it's not just going to a Grateful Dead show and listening to a bunch of people talk about how tripped out they are. When you train in a proper institution to do psychedelic assisted therapy, of course, you're already a licensed psychologist or a licensed social worker. But when you train to do this, you learn how to help a person who's in a specific neurological place to connect with their feelings and to process them. So that is a huge part of this healing process is we've created a state that's in many ways similar to mindfulness. Mindfulness meditation, deep trauma work, as people like Reb Shimon Russell will call it, is where the person is relaxed and they're able to access things deeply inside of them. Psychedelics.
So the mechanics of this are essentially that the patient gets high in the doctor's office, so now they can begin the therapy. I know I didn't mean to give any.
No. That's exactly what we're talking about. This is a shortcut to that deep place.
Right.
Because it removes the self. It removes the I, which is that defense mechanism that is naturally put up. So a person, you're essentially breaking through the barrier of that almost natural defense mechanism through.
If you want to get shrinky, sure. If you want to get shrinky, sure. I mean, I have a cigar and a couch, we can do that. But we could also just say it just relaxes you in the most deep and intense way. So you're just there.
But are you going to some other place that doesn't really represent, or it's not an extension of you, in the sense that what happens when you come down from this? I've never taken a psychedelic that I know of. What happens when you come off or you come down it? If it's what allowed you to be the most real and most uninhibited and remove the ego and the self, so when the self and the ego come back, does the positive outcome of the work remain, or now you negated whatever you had accomplished, unless you're going to be high on psychedelics the rest of your life?
I would say that for people who have not experienced this, but are in our community and have had tremendous davening experiences, the first time that you were on your NCSY Kollel trip to Eretz Yisrael and you're davening Kabbalah Shabbos by the Koisel, your tefillah 1 week later at Mincha, when you're davening on a bus because you're trying to get to your uncle's in time for dinner, is not going to be the same. But the memory still stays with you because we're talking about a deep spiritual place. And that's what happens with psychedelics. It's the shortcut to it in many ways in a guided fashion. But it's not just that, because there's also a change that happens. I have a colleague whose name is Dr. Stuart Seidman. He's an incredible person. He's really one of the gurus doing this, and he has a ketamine clinic here in Eretz Yisrael. They do not do ketamine psychotherapy. They just do an infusion of the drug, and they do it 1, 2, 3 times a week, and then the person comes back, make sure that they're okay. They do another one and another one and another one, and people also get better in a very profound way. So you might say, how is that possible? And the answer is because these drugs create something which is called neuroplasticity. So the neurons, the cells in our brain, talk to each other in a new way, and new connections are built, and old connections are broken down. In the literature, they talk about what's called the reset of the default network, which is where the way that our mind is just used to thinking on autopilot throughout the day is just shut off, like a Nintendo game back in the day. This is a brand new process. So it allows the brain to reset, to start from scratch, and causes new connections through chemicals like BDNP, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is the same chemical that's released after seizures when the brain is resetting in epilepsy, which is the same chemical that's released during intense cardiovascular exercise, which is why we feel sharper after we go for a run in the morning, which is the same chemical associated with mindfulness meditation, John Kabat-Zinn type stuff, as well as with deep spiritual exercises and a good night's sleep, of course. So
Dr. Freedman,
these
so
chemical
I'm listening
changes,
to
though,
you.
that are
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm listening to you, and I'm saying to myself, I'm in. Where can I get some? I want to try that because, or I'm saying to myself, there's somebody that I've been trying to convince that there is a God, or that their soul is worthy, or that they can connect and surrender to Hashem. And why do you have to have treatment-resistant depression to take this? If it's doing all the things you just described, why shouldn't everyone say, you know what? We can have the greatest kumsitz, the greatest farbrengen, and the greatest tish of all time. We're going to have the most incredible kiddush. Everybody take a psychedelic. We're going to sit down and we're going to learn Ravitch Meyer. Everyone take a psychedelic. We're going to sit down and we're going to really experience Elul this year. Well, why isn't it for everyone if it works in the way that you say? Everyone needs to remove their ego and their self a little bit. Everybody needs to become a little more uninhibited. Everybody needs to be able to reach into the deepest part of themselves and their subconscious they may not even be aware of. So is this for everyone, or is it only for those subset who really need it? And how do we define that?
That's a great question, Arav. And I would say that you are better equipped to philosophize on this topic of Lufum Sara Agra. In that when we train for a marathon, it's a lot more exciting than just going and driving down the Boston Common and saying, wow, 26 miles has a lot of traffic. Okay? The more that we put into something, the more meaningful the journey is. I would also say that there are a lot of Hasidic gurus and other type folks that run retreats for spirituality in Mexico and other fun places where you can go ahead and take psychedelic drugs there. And there are folks who think that that's mutter and folks that think that that's fun. And then periodically people have psychotic episodes. Some folks might be unhappy to hear that there was a fellow who was having challenges with his marriage, and he went to an unlicensed therapy location in the middle of Beitar, took a psychedelic drug back in 2021, returned to his home in Kiryat Gat, and stabbed his son 14 times to death, and had no idea what happened. He woke up in a psych hospital to hear that his son had died, and he was not charged with murder because it wasn't his fault. He had taken a substance that took away all rationality by him. And who was charged? The therapist, with 6 counts of negligence. There's a person who's dead because of this. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example, but there are many people that have these stories.
So can you share maybe some other can you share some other negative or some other dangers associated with psychedelic assisted therapy?
Or just with taking psychedelics in a recreational setting, for sure. Because remember, when you do psychedelic assisted therapy, or when you take a psychedelic treatment as part of a medical treatment plan, you know what you're taking because we know what the chemical is, meaning it's not laced with fentanyl or something cheaper that just will change your brain pattern. Okay? You know what dose you're taking, meaning it's not too small that there's only a placebo effect, and it's not too large that you can have cardiovascular instability associated with methamphetamines or LSD. If you go to an emergency room in any big city, you will reliably see one person each night who came in from a rave who's done way too much drugs, and they're having something perhaps called serotonin syndrome or some other sort of serious complication that puts their life at risk. I would also say that a review of psychosis associated with ayahuasca back in 2017 showed that people with a history of serious psychiatric illness, people with a history of a family member who had schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, are at tremendous risk of experiencing a psychotic episode. And this is dangerous stuff. Oftentimes, people will not just develop a mental illness. They have a genetic predisposition, and then an environmental stressor. And what could be a greater environmental stressor than recreational psychedelic drug use? And recreational psychedelic drug use is anybody who doesn't get it from a doctor in a controlled treatment setting, because you don't know the dose, there's no proper monitoring, and frankly, terrible things can happen. Not to also rule out the fact that if you really want to get better from this stuff, you got to do it with trained professionals, not just with some funny guy who went to India for a bunch of years and came back with the fact that this is the new thing to do.
And it
You
even
would
might be,
trust that guy
what you're saying is that psychedelics might enable a shortcut to discovery and to spirituality. A, it may not be authentic, but B, it's not our task and our mission. We're not given the shortcuts. We have to put in the hard work. It's meant only to be a therapeutic response to help people. But here's my question, Dr. Freedman, is that as you say that it should only be administered in a medical setting for medical professionals under medical supervision and medically indicated, all that makes sense to me, and of course I agree with wholeheartedly, what would you say to the cynic who says, is that the same medical community that denied the value of psychedelics all this year, that now that they've tripped upon it, pun intended, now that they've discovered psychedelics, they're the only ones we should trust? Wouldn't the cynic and sarcastic person say that people have been singing the praises of psychedelics for years? The medical establishment, Western medicine, said absolutely not. And now that the Western medicine is on board, now they're saying, but we're the only ones who should determine and administer. What would you respond to a cynic who said that?
I don't think it's particularly cynical. I think it's a very, very good question. And it's a very fair one, frankly. We're Yidden, though, and I don't know when this is going to air, but presumably somewhere close to Elul. So we believe in tshuva. There's nothing wrong with saying this is a terrible idea, learning more about it, and saying, I'm sorry, I think there's serious potential here. And I think we've seen that with many things over the history of medicine. I think that we have to be honest that we see this in many fields in general. What was the best insulating method for keeping your heating costs down back in America 70 years ago? It was asbestos. And asbestos, killed Warren Zevon via mesothelioma. You can't just go around killing Warren Zevon. So, the people realized they made a mistake, and things change, and hopefully it should not be done like that. I will tell you, these are serious compounds, though. Every single night in the emergency room when I was a resident, you would see a kid from any one of the 20 colleges within the Boston area come in and tell you he's talking to the plants. He was brought in by the dorm dad, and he's just there talking to the plants in the emergency room. Now, I guess you could say all of us can talk to the plants, but when the plants talk back, that's a bit of a problem. Folks would get admitted to the unit, and psychedelics can and do unmask serious mental illness in people who have a genetic predisposition. And people who have a genetic predisposition are most likely to be risk takers just by nature in general. So this is something that requires support. And again, if you had asked me 5 years ago, the answer was no, 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 no. The answer a year ago was no, 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 but let's see. And now the answer is no, no, but in certain circumstances, absolutely. And in Yirtz Hashem, we're going to learn a lot more. So as we go on, we're always learning more things, no matter what we do with Torah as well. So,
yeah. Dr. Freedman, thank you. Do you have any final thoughts around the very complex and important topic here?
Yeah, I would tell you a quick story from my own life, not related to psychedelics, but rather related to going quarry jumping. So a bunch of my friends were literally jumping off of a bridge. And my dad said to me, you can't do that. And I said, why? He said, just because all of your friends are jumping off of a bridge doesn't mean that you have to. And I said, yeah, but some of them are landing okay. So he said, wait until a lot of them land okay. Meaning, let's just wait until the data comes in, because it's coming in. MDMA is going to be legal in a treatment setting very soon, and it's going to be safe, and it's going to be done in a way where people can really benefit from it. But you don't want to do this and be that guy who has a crazy episode. You don't want to take the wrong dose of this, because somebody just doesn't know how much to give you. There is no data suggesting that microdosing is associated with any significant change beyond placebo as of now. So a lot of people are saying a lot of things and doing a lot of things. I believe that many of us in the medical field are very open-minded, but wait until the research comes in. And when it does, in Yirtzeh Hashem, people can really benefit. One more time, I'd just like to say, this is really exciting, really dangerous in the wrong setting, and really a life-saving treatment in the correct setting. So I absolutely appreciate the two of you so much for the things you're doing in our community. It bothers me that you stole Donnie Silverstein, but I'm sure he's doing good stuff, and maybe you can send him back eventually. And if I can ever be helpful, my zichus.
We appreciate it. We appreciate it. And I wanted to say it's amazing to speak to two professionals who have the intellectual honesty to recognize it. And Dr. Freedman, the way you just spoke about the medical community and any community that's willing to say, you know, we learn, we made mistakes, we grow, but yet as you're describing, the margin of error seems incredibly small for this. So it's not the kind of thing that's like, I had a friend or I heard, or it could benefit, or hey, do you want to try it? The margin of error is really, really small. So it's enormously high risk. So it's really all about in the right setting, in the right circumstances as benefits. But just because we're now talking about and recognizing those benefits doesn't mean, and that is a danger of this, which, you know, we'll continue to talk about through this episode and beyond, is once we say ecstasy has a value, do we now worry that, you know, the unsophisticated people who are not nuanced are going to just say, oh, I heard there was a podcast where people with yarmulkes said ecstasy is really good for helping you feel good and get over being down and depressed. And that's this narrow place that we have to walk and being responsible with it. But I learned an enormous amount, and we thank you for your time.
Yes, sir, Claire.
Ari, we're really grateful to welcome you to Out of the Shadows. Thank you so much for the courage. Really, it takes enormous courage to be willing to publicly share your experience in a way that can, and we know from our previous experience and episodes that it absolutely will help people, as the previous episodes have. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your story, your background, and why you're part of this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And for me, it's a privilege to share this. As I've experienced my journey, I've only reached the point where I'm at today because of the support of others that have been along and supported me throughout my journey. And therefore, I consider it, you know, a kind of pay it forward to be able to share this with people and for them to grow and learn from my experiences and be able to share that with people as it's been shared with me. So I appreciate that. My background is I grew up in Brooklyn with two Bali Tshuva parents. And so I kind of didn't have a conventional, you know, FFB from birth experience growing up. My parents progressively became more from as they went on. And due to that, there was a uniqueness in the way that I grew up. So I started by going off to yeshiva in Flatbush called Mizrachi Lebanim. And I grew up, you know, doing the Pledge of Allegiance and as well as Hatikva in the morning. From there, my parents sent me to Taras Emes Kamenetz. So that was that was a major, you know, change in approach.
All right, I went to an elementary school called Taras Emes, and we did and we pledged allegiance to the flag every morning.
Yeah, it was a different time. And from then, 8th grade, I went to Scranton Yeshiva. So I really experienced at a very extreme level the yeshivishness, and I bought into it. I was, you know, at one point, you know, 18 hours a day of learning and really buying into the whole thing. And it was a wonderful experience for me as that as well. And then as life continued, you know, I had already starting from the age of 10, I had traumas, you know, starting to pop up in my life, as we all do. One of the big things I learned throughout my journey is that, you know, traumas happen to everyone. And just because it's trauma doesn't mean it has to be traumatic and have a longer lasting impact. And, but at the time I didn't have the tools. My parents didn't have the tools. We didn't have the resources. I grew up with very, very few resources. I mean, I would consider ourselves poor growing up, you know, credit card bills issues, being able to make tuition. And we felt that as a family. My mother has been chronically ill since before she got married. So there was a component of having a physically debilitated mother in, as part of the process. And when I was 10 years old, we had a fire in my house, and it kind of like upended everything. And from that point forward, as stable things were up until that point, like things really started to unravel. My mother ended up in the hospital for about 10 months at a shot when I was in fourth or fifth grade, after that happened. And fast forward a few years, while I was in Scranton, my father very suddenly and surprisingly got sick with cancer, and he passed away when I was in 12th grade. And then I had an experience where I was the victim of a sexual abuse while I was in Scranton. So once I was leaving, my father had passed away. Like, I couldn't stick with the yeshivish path anymore. It just wasn't working for me anymore. So I just kind of left Scranton, and I was floating for a while. And as time went on, I got picked up by different people. There was a program in Lakewood called Chavri HaKollel. It was kind of a gathering place for kids throughout high school and post-Israel, trying to find themselves. And, at that point, I was very, very money insecure. I didn't really have any resources coming from my parents at the time, and from my mom at the time. My father's out of the picture now. So I would, I've considered myself sort of self-sufficient since I'm 13 years old. I truly became independent and self-sufficient at the age of 17, 18. And without going into all the details, because there's a lot of stories I could tell along the way, things were difficult for a good 7-8 years. I was living in someone's basement out of the kindness, out of his heart, doing odd jobs, working in Judaica stores, stocking shelves, driving, delivering cleaners to make it. And then eventually I got married, and I started a job at, and I really started getting very, very successful. I've always been a hustler and worked very, very hard. Thank God I'm blessed to be smart, creative, a go-getter, friendly. I connect well with people. And my career really took off, and I started a platform in a prominent firm. And, fast forward 12 years later, I was an advisor in the healthcare space that had advised and transacted on $16 billion worth of transactions. And as time went on, I'm making more and more money, and in my head, having grown up money insecure, and at times even food insecure, in my head, like in my mind, getting all this and obtaining all this was the answer. And the more money that I made, and like year over year, I continued to grow in my financial success. But yet I was getting like lost in the process, and I didn't realize it. I mean, it's very, at the time, like, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Look how successful I am. It's as cliche as it all sounds. All those cliches are true. I think in my experiences is you have to experience the cliche for you to understand that it's not one. And, so the money doesn't buy you happiness, and all these accomplishments are not going to give you self-worth. But I didn't even know these, the words that I'm using, these buzzwords, these therapy words that we consider them, like, I didn't even understand them. I ignored them. If you told me this shared these things with me, 4 or 5 years ago, I was the skeptic working in New York City that would have looked at you and say, okay, you're the hippie, and I'm sure that works for you, but I live in the real corporate world, and this is how it is. And things came to a head. I mean, all the childhood traumas I had, I experienced a very, very difficult marriage that, admittedly, I had brought in a lot of my traumas into that marriage because they were undealt with. And I started struggling. Over time, I had been struggling with depression and anxiety. At times when I fell into depression, I mean, I would consider it today what, MDD, major depressive disorder. I mean, I would spiral out of control, and sometimes it could be, weeks for me to get out of it. And I thought that this was normal. So I'm like, yeah, I got to kind of like break through that wall and just power through it, because that's what everyone around me was telling me.
What would that look like for you? You'd be under the covers, couldn't get out of bed. Would you be going to work? What would it look like when you were in that state?
I mean, at the worst of it, and again, I'm comfortable sharing these things because I feel like, having spoken to friends and other people that have opened to me during this process, I think a lot of them have had these experiences, so a lot of people can relate. I mean, I were at times at work feeling worthless about myself because a deal is going sideways, and I'd go into one of the private bathrooms, go into the closet, close the closet door, and cry myself there for 20 minutes, half an hour, wipe it off, wash my face off, go out there and just muscle through.
Yeah.
Wow.
Did you feel, Ari, part of obviously this entire platform is to encourage and to stimulate dialogue across mental health issues, anxiety, depression. Did you feel like you didn't have a place to a community to speak to? Is there somebody that you would have loved to speak with while you were going through it? Or you were this, corporate guy, successful externally, and you didn't really, there was no one that you can talk to about it?
Definitely the latter. And I wouldn't say that it's because there was no one for me to talk to about it. It's because I wasn't prepared to talk about it. I mean, you could have put the most understanding, world-renowned therapist in the room with me, or my best friend in the room with me. And when we talk about the flight or freeze part of the brain, I was, for the most part, like in the most traumatic moments, I was a freeze guy. And that came about in the sexual assault story, and that reaction stayed with me. So if I was going through a particularly rough time and I was just spiraling out of control in my head, and someone would be like, talk to me, whether it was my ex-wife at the time or a friend, or I just couldn't do it, and I'll be like, I'm just telling myself, I'm just going to get through this. This is like the negative talk. I struggled a lot with negative ruminating speak to myself. So it was a lot of stop being so pathetic, get out of bed, people have it worse than you, what's wrong with you? And it was just it was really the negative and the fear that came along with the money insecurity. It was propelling me forward. So as much as sometimes I felt like I can't do this anymore, this is way too much, but that money insecurity and would rear its ugly head as just one aspect of this, and it would just propel me forward. So my success was very much fear driven.
Yeah. And then did you attempt to engage in therapy? Would you maybe talk a little bit about kind of the transition of initially working with the therapist or going to some program, and then how that moved into this psychedelic assisted therapy?
What stimulated, just to piggyback Moshe, your question, if you were trying to take care of it yourself, and if there was no one who could say something that would make you listen, what made you finally say, I've got to treat this, I got to try to take care of this?
Due to the sensitivities of some aspects of this that are confidential that would affect the people around me, I can't get into all the impetuses, but about 3.5 years ago, some incidents occurred, and I can share the parts that affected me. So at that time, I was advised to go to a program in Arizona called PCS Psychological Services. It's an intensive outpatient program. Specifically, it's not an addiction program. It's specifically for underlying traumas and the causation of depression and anxiety. And I basically was pushed into the door to go there. It wasn't something, because again, I was still sitting there saying, oh, I'm fine. People go through this all the time. And, it's almost like normal. I normalized even the attempt. At that point, though, it was known by too many people in my circle that wouldn't allow it to be ignored anymore. So I went to this program. It's an 8-day program in Arizona. It's 12 hours of therapy a day. Midway through the first week, I was being told by the therapist that if you don't become more open to this process and accept it more, then you've really kind of wasted your time and you might as well go back home. And one of the unique things and great things about me is that I just won't give up on anything. And at this point, when someone tells me oh, you're just wasting your time, you can't do this, it was that's when it turned on for me. I'm like, well, I'll show you. And really, I mean, there's so many pivotal moments throughout the journey, but that was certainly a pivotal one, because I'm there already. I know I'm starting to break down, everything's starting to come out, but for them to look at me and be like, hey, you have so much more work to do and you're really not open to it. And truly at the time, I'm here. I was offended. I remember walking into my lead therapist's office, because you see, 10 to 15 therapists throughout the week over there between group and individual. And I'm like, you know what, if you're going to treat me like this and talk to me about like me to this way and not recognize the efforts that I'm putting in, then maybe I don't belong here. And she's like, okay, if that's your choice. Then no one's spoken to me that way before. Oh, that's your choice. Everything's a choice. All of a sudden I'm like, well, if you're going to put it on me and make it my choice, then I don't have an easy out over here. I'm not going to take that sitting down. So I doubled down for the rest of the week. And 2 days later, I realized that they were right. And I said, like, I don't think I've gotten enough out of the first week over here. And I ended up extending to a second week, which is very rare for the program. It's very, very intense. It's very, very difficult. After the 12 hours of therapy, you're bringing a few hours of homework to your hotel room or wherever you're staying. And it's really almost like, when you add up everything, 18 hours a day of therapy and work on yourself. And then after the second week, I extended a third week, which is unheard of over there. And by the time, and I'm unpacking all these things, I never disclosed to anyone in my life about the sexual trauma. Never. It was the first time that I started opening up. I had never really processed through my father's death, my mother's illness, the food insecurities, the loneliness that I experienced because I was on my own a lot. I was independent. I never moved back home after I left Scranton. So from the moment I was 13 years old till today, I've been under my own dominion. So at the end of the third week, I said, I'm not ready. I want to stay a fourth week. And they're like, all right, you got to go out there and practice some of this stuff. Like, you can't just stay in this cocoon. And I was very afraid to go back. And I did go back, and I went back to work. I went back to the job, and I started unpacking. I started working through it again. And I went back to PCS for another week, a year later in the next summer. And throughout this time, when I went to PCS the first time, about 3 months prior is when I got my first therapist. I had gotten a therapist after my father passed away. It was a horrible experience, and I wrote off therapists for the rest of my life, and I promised I would never go back again. And again, the only reason why I went back is because I was really deteriorating at that point. So I'm seeing my therapist. I've gone through 2 rounds of PCS. I'm separated from my wife at that point for about 2-3 years, leading up to it. And in 2022, I'm at the height of my career. The last year that I was there, I transacted on $5.6 billion, which was up year over year over year. And I got towards the end of 2022, the relationship with my kids were, really not where I wanted them to be. I was an absentee father for many years. My marriage had completely fallen apart at that point. And there's something about me, I always come to the edge of the cliff, but I have a bracha, and it's kind of like what I consider my hashgacha, which is there's always something about me that never lets me completely go off the edge. And I just kind of knew for myself at the end of 2021, that I had to stop this. So at the beginning of 2022, I decided that I'm going to leave Meridian, which was unheard of, given my success over there. And 2022 was trending to be even better than 2021. And I left, and I thought I was really, really smart, and I could kind of skip the system and just get ahead of everyone because I'm smarter than everyone. So I had greased the skids to leave towards something while I was leaving Meridian. And so I did. I left Meridian. It was a very, very difficult transition. I was not prepared for it at all. I really didn't know. I mean, I was going to 20 hours a day. So when I started pulling back, it wasn't just the accomplishment of all. It's what I've learned is that people suffer being bored. Boredom is torture for people, and people don't talk like that. But if you ask them, boredom causes us to make really poor decisions, because the inability to be with ourselves because it's so uncomfortable causes us to just do things for the sake of doing things. And when you're doing things without intention, without a purpose, without a goal, without thoughtfulness, it just ends up being like a hamster on a wheel and running in one place, but you're getting tired along the way. It's tired to run. It's tiring to keep on trying and doing and accomplishing, and looking for that validation in it to yourself and never getting it. And it just becomes exhausting. So after 6 months of trying this new venture, I realized I had once again got into another partnership that didn't work for me. I walked away from that, and for the first time in my life, I had nothing going on. When I was in Scranton, after Scranton, I was involved with causes. I was the life of the party. If you told anyone, from that aspects of my life that they hear this, that I was going through, they wouldn't believe it. I was a division head in Camp Simcha. I started the organization Kids of Courage with Dr. Dietrich and Hallie Kafka and a few partners. I was the guy on the stage, programming, doing the trips, successful in business, surrounded by friends, but I was as lonely as it could be. after the failure of this new venture, after I left Meridian, I didn't have anything prepared anymore. Like, this was it. I had gone back to PCS with my with my now ex-wife to work through the issues that we had, so I can kind of have healing from that. And this was in February, so now I'm in the summer. I have nothing going on, and I just sat home for 3 months doing absolutely nothing. And it was torture to the max. It was when my eyes woke up in the morning, I would beg Hashem and myself to can I go back to sleep, because I don't understand the purpose of me being awake. There's no purpose of me being awake, because what am I going to do? And that's what I mean. Like, boredom sounds like such an innocuous word, such a tame word, a powerful word, right. But really, the inability to get up every morning, and it's worth getting up just because it's worth getting up. Life is great. I have money in the bank. I have food in the fridge. I have a hot shower waiting for me. I have children. I have 3 kids that love and adore me. But it was never enough, because it didn't feel like the type of accomplishment that I felt like I needed to create validation and self-worth. So when I didn't have any of those things, I completely broke down. I mean, it was...
And the therapy, you were seeing a therapist at the time, but it wasn't...
Yeah, therapy 2, even 3 times a week. I had done a number of different modalities while I was in PCS, EMDR, guided imagery, hypnosis, all sorts of psychodrama. I mean, you name it, I've done it. I was on medications at the time. I played around with the medications, antidepressants, mood stabilizers, medication for anxiety. Throughout this process, I'm doing a lot of work on myself. So, I stopped drinking alcohol 2.5 years ago on my own, because I realized that it was causing issues with my depression. But none of it was really helping to me, because I was just suffering inside. And, throughout this period, all this stuff that, I kind of had opened up the can of worms in a positive way, by going to PCS, by opening up to therapists. But I truly wasn't really ready to handle the real consequences that came from this. So I was of the opinion that you're going to question how I talk to people, or you're going to question how I go about things, or I approach things, or how I do business. And when people questioned me on those things, it felt like it was questioning my essence. Really, it was questioning my actions. But by questioning my actions, I felt like you were questioning me. So I wouldn't want to change anything.
So Ari, you're attempting, it sounds like you're really investing yourself and exploring these multiple modalities on an outpatient level, inpatient level. How did the transition go to psychedelic treatment? What was that like?
So about 1.5 years prior to the breakdown in the summer of 2022, because medication wasn't working for me, it had been advised to me to try ketamine. So I had done about 1.5 years worth of ketamine, but not in the conventional sense. Conventional ketamine treatments, are 6 to 8 treatments over the course of a few weeks. It's given IV. You sit in a chair. You have a mask on. It's an internal process. The way I did it was more of a journey and a ceremony. So I got it IM, which means intramuscular, which means that you're not once it's in your system, you're along for the ride, because it's not IV that you can regulate, just stop it on a dime or not. So. And I was guided through it with the doctor that was administering it, as well as a psychotherapist that was with me in the room. So I had a touch of experience with guided journeying with ketamine.
And it seems like you're doing it in the right way, meaning you had a medical professional along with a clinical professional, not to differentiate between the two, but it was under a therapeutic structure.
It was very. The doctor who administered it is an MD. Yeah. Who had been practicing this for a number of years. The psychotherapist had specific experience with ketamine. I was very lucky. My psychiatrist at the time suggested it to me almost as an option of last resort. People talk about ketamine today very, typical. 1.5 years ago, ketamine was, or 2 years ago, even when I first started, ketamine was at the beginning moments, at its infancy of being legal and proven as a treatment for this, but people accepting it. So it took me 1.5 months of research before I got comfortable doing ketamine, and it helped me along the way, but I was still really, really struggling. So at the end of towards the end of the summer of 2022, I had some people in my life that had experienced ayahuasca. I was waking up every day, fearful.
Was the ketamine being administered in that way, was it different than what you had tried until then?
So I had not gone back to ketamine at that point. I mean, the last ketamine treatment that I had gotten at that point was probably about 4 months prior. And a few friends of mine had experienced ayahuasca. So I felt like I had nothing to lose at that point. So I went down to Mexico and I experienced ayahuasca, which was my first psychedelic treatment.
What was that like for you, Ari?
Ayahuasca is a very, very, I don't want to use the word tough because I think people associate a negative connotation with it. It really tells you who you are at the core of it, whether you're ready to hear it or not. And it'll go through your traumas, it'll rip apart everything. And some people experience it in a way where it's very light. They feel much more connected spiritually. They feel much happier and joyous. And that feeling can last, I mean, typically in different psychedelics, that period can last for a few weeks to even a few months. There are other people that go to ayahuasca, and it's a really, really tough process because, like, for me, the way I experienced it, my anxiety just hit, it blew the thermometer off. When I came back from ayahuasca, which was a week process, I had a breakdown the next day that I came back, to the point where my therapist was asking me on the phone, does she need to admit me? And again, never challenged me like that, because I'm like, no. That now I'm going to get myself in check. And after, ayahuasca was a very, very tough process for me, but it did wonders for me. It really started, like, it made the anxiety so acute and so untenable, to the point where I'm like, you know what? I have no other choice other than to work through this. And it takes, people ask me, like, would you suggest ayahuasca easily? And my answer is not for everyone, and in a lot of circumstances, not, because I think that there are psychedelics out there that are an easier gateway into the healing that can come from psychedelics. But ayahuasca is a beautiful medicine that helps people. And I've seen so many people grow from it, including myself. It's just not an easy gateway into getting into this sort of journey, but that's my experience, that's my journey. Yeah. And for me, I've done so much work to live in the present today, and living in that present moment and seeing what ayahuasca did for me, even if it was hard to see it then, it was a game changer for me. And
fast forward today, so you're still engaging in that with therapy, and how are you feeling today?
So today I'm in a different place. The ayahuasca was the kickstart to do a journey of psychedelics. So over time, I've done ayahuasca, I've done MDMA therapy, I've done psilocybin therapy, I've done a few that are not as known out there, such as Kana, and I've done really the most important thing about the psychedelic treatments and why they work is all about the intention setting and the processing after you do it. The integration is what they call it. I mean, people from the late 60s and early 70s can regale you with stories of psychedelics and the experiences that they have. And they probably took, LSD and all these things for years, but you look at them today, they're not balanced people. So it means that the medicine itself is not an antibiotic. It doesn't just, you don't take it and it works. It's really about what your intention with it. So if you want to party with it, it's going to be a great party drug. But if you want to do therapy with it, it really is going to open you up to a world that you have not, that people have not experienced before.
And I think that, Ari, that's an important point that we've been discussing here, is that it's not, an isolated experience, but it really needs to be integrated into and guided into, a therapeutic context.
Absolutely. So, I mean, for my first few treatments, when I was doing psychedelic treatments, I spent hours on the phone with the guides. And again, you have to be careful with the guides. There are people out there that are unscrupulous with it, and, they don't have the experience with it necessary. The guides that I've worked with I have numerous guides depending on the medicines that I was taking. The person who I experienced ayahuasca with has been doing this for decades. The woman who I did MDMA with has been doing this for over 30 years. The woman who I did psilocybin with has been doing it for over 23 years. So these are people that really, really understand it. And, for people out there who are listening to this, while MDMA is not FDA approved yet as a treatment, they're in clinical 3 trials and projected to be approved by the FDA to be approved as a treatment for PTSD in 2024.
Wow.
So there are over 30 years of clinical trials that this works. This is not, this is not heebie-jeebie stuff that doesn't have kind of Western medicine and science behind it. I mean, they've done a lot of research in this to know that it's safe and
Ari, you'd say
effective.
it's been helpful for you in ways that other things have not. No, that's not to reject those other modalities for other people, that it could be very effective, but for you, utilizing this in a safe way and in a supervised way has been effective for you?
Absolutely. I think, the medications and the modalities. I went into psychedelics having done, again, I did PCS at that point. I was doing therapy 2-3 times a week. I was on medication. So I was bringing in, I have 3 journals, front to cover, that are filled just from my notes from going to PCS. So I had done a lot of work. So for me, what the psychedelics did for me is it kind of took away this barrier between the intelligence of understanding of the therapeutic intelligence and knowledge and wisdom that was handed over to me. But for me, the question had always been, how do I internalize this? It's great to academically and intelligently know that things are temporary, things will be good, things are good. You have to let things through, find gratitude in life. But I didn't know how to do it. I remember there was a moment in ayahuasca after I had drank the first night, and a lot of things come up, and I'm speaking to, I did it with a Frum guy and his wife who does this in Mexico, and they do a lot of integration throughout the week. And I remember him saying, like, Ari, he said, a human being is a keli, and he's a vessel, and the vessel can be full of expectations, or it could be full of bracha. And the more we fill up with expectations, we're just a keli. We are who we are, and there's only a certain amount that can go into us. And if we fill it up with expectations, it doesn't leave room for the bracha to come into. So he's like, Ari, feel the gratitude, feel Hashem, feel whatever it is for you. He really doesn't push religion or anything. It's really whatever you connect to. But the point is, stop thinking about it, feel it. And I remember looking at him and his wife. I mean, we would do this for hours. And I remember him and his wife like telling this to me, and I'd be like, so what do I do? Do I think positive? They're like, no, don't think positive, feel positive. And I remember crying to them, literally tears streaming down my face. And I'm like, I don't understand what that means. You're asking me to do something that I don't have the capability of doing. I don't know. I don't even know what you're talking. What do you mean to feel that? I don't understand what you're saying. And I just had long walks on the beach in Mexico, and then coming back from this, when I came back from ayahuasca, and I was really in a precarious situation, and I needed whatever my own form of integration was. I ended up doing hours a week of hypnosis, hours a week of EMDR, and on therapy, and working through these things. And it was just rungs on a ladder. And then I went to my next psychedelic experience, and I unpacked more, and then processed through it, waited a month and a half, then went back in. And it's a difficult, at sometimes painful process, because really what they're doing is they're tearing apart all these walls that you put up. At the essence, we're all good people. We're all good-hearted. We all think positive. When, again, it sounds cliche, and I always try to think of how to say things that are more relatable than the therapeutic ways that things are said, where everyone's like, nah, I've heard that 1,000 times before. Like, when we're a child and we know nothing better, it's just unbridled joy. We cry when we want to, when things are bothering us. We're happy when we're just happy. Sometimes you ask a kid, like, what are you laughing about? I don't know, I just can't stop laughing. I mean, that is at the essence of who we are. But then as we go through life, we have these experiences, and people will put us down. We'll experience sadness. We'll experience grief. And without the proper tools, which most of us don't have, because life, it's difficult to figure these things out, these things start covering ourselves up. And really what the psychedelics do more than anything else, you can talk about it being trippy and seeing things and everything like that, but what's not spoken about, psychedelics cuts away everything and tells you who you are. And it'll allow you to process through, traumas that experience. I mean, the reason why MDMA is so effective for PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So these are, learned behaviors that are, and negative behaviors that are coming as an effect of a trauma, right? What is there's a logic behind why these medicines are working. MDMA, for anyone that ever heard of ecstasy or Molly, pure MDMA is the active ingredient in these things. So they, on as a drug, people will take it at a party and everything because it gives them total elation. Well, what if you take that medication, MDMA, under a guide with the intention of, I have this terrible trauma in my life that I have always associated a negative connotation with, and then take this medicine and with the intention of re-examining this trauma, and then all of a sudden realizing that what happened in the trauma is just a fact, but our interpretation and what we learn from that trauma is the traumatic part. So when I had the fire in my house, to me, this was like, I felt insecure. Where am I going to live? I'm 10 years old. I'm out on the curb watching my house go up into flames. I'm seeing my parents freak out, and like, these are the strong people in my life. They should be the ones knowing what to do and like telling me what to do. And suddenly I'm scared because they're scared. And that fear stayed for me the rest of my life, unconsciously until I'm in my 30s, and then consciously for the last 3 years as I started unpacking a PCS, but I still don't know how to deal with it. And my first time I'm in MDMA, this fire comes up. I remember being transported back to the fire. I'm back in my 10-year-old body on the sidewalk on a cold December Shabbos day with my family standing behind me, watching my house go up into flames. And there's talk therapy going on. You have a mask on, so it's a very internal process. And you're talking to the guide and processing through these things while you're on the medicine. And I remember telling her, I said, Julia, hey, we're out on the curb and there's a fire going on. But look, it's 25 years later and all my siblings and I are married and we have kids and we're doing well and we're healthy and we made it out and we're fine. And Julia's like, yeah, feel that feeling. And then I stopped for a minute and I'm like, Julia, I'm noticing the fire and the smoke. I'm there, I'm re-experiencing, I'm seeing the fire and the smoke going up and my house going up in flames. And I'm like, it's beautiful. I've never seen fire and smoke like this in my life. And I use that example, which seems extreme. And when I share it with people, sometimes they're like, what are you talking about? And I get it. I understand why it sounds unbelievable. And I was the biggest skeptic of them all. And this is the fact. This is what happened to me. This is what I experienced. And having done the research because I'm a very cerebral guy and I like to understand the things that I'm doing, and I started reading into it and researching it and talking to the guides, it's the fire happened. And it might seem preposterous to a person to look at a fire and say, wow, that's beautiful and amazing. But guess what? The same choice that we have, even though it's the more common choice to say fires are terrible and look what it did to you and like, it's terrible and it's so sad what you went through, I have the same ability to make the choice to say that fire is beautiful and wonderful. Now, I wasn't able to see that on my own, but I discovered a tool called MDMA that allowed me to experience it that way. And it's such a feeling experience, going back to what I was being told in ayahuasca, don't make it intelligence, don't make it knowledge, feel it. Wow. In these sessions, if you're approaching it with the right way, you can feel through it.
Ari, I want to thank you. We could speak to you for hours, and maybe we still will and need to in a future episode. Again, your courage and your vulnerability and your willingness to share, it's unbelievable, your story and your experience and your knowledge. And thank you, because it's going to empower others. And just to reiterate what you've said, what we've been saying all along, it needs to be supervised. It needs to be medically mandated. It needs to be after traditional modalities have been tried. This is not something experimental or recreational or fun or something to do when you don't even know exactly what you're taking. That's not what this episode is about, but you really are an example of somebody who has survived significant traumas and discovered this amazing tool that Hashem has given us to use, and you've used in the most productive way. So from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you. And I'm always happy to come back on and share more. I truly believe that there's so much for people to gain from this. And for me, it's been an absolute game changer in my life. I'm so grateful, which is a big thing in my life right now. I'm so grateful that I got to experience this the way that I did. And I continue to grow and I continue to work. There's no destination for this stuff, as you guys know, and everyone should hear. It's a process of growth, and I'm really grateful of where I'm at today.
Incredible. Really beautiful story, and thank you for sharing it.
Wow, Moshe, I don't know that I ever got such an education in such a short time, and I don't mean to say I'm educated on this topic. I'm still an ignoramus and a novice, but what a complicated, important, clearly positive breakthrough, but also dangerous topic. And I'm so grateful to you for suggesting we tackle it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we had to. I think that there's so much talk and there's a lot of misguidance and there's a lot of curiosity. And that's what we're doing here. We're really just trying to take these complex topics and bring them to the forefront, encourage people to speak about them, to explore them, to navigate this entire, mental health issues. And that's the goal. So we have to do it. We have to, showcase that it's a modality out there that is confusing to a lot of people. And I think in time it'll become more clear and there will be larger, just more research and, people will be able to add another tool to the toolbox of helping individuals heal from a whole slew of issues.
Absolutely. And, for us, it's an honor to create or provide the platform for these discussions. And
Yeah.
we get feedback all the time from people who say, thank you. Thank you for eliminating the stigma. Thank you for letting us come out of the shadows. Thank you for letting us feel normal and real and that this is life. And, here's another one of those topics. Dr. Freedman is incredibly knowledgeable and smart, but also funny and engaging. And he was great. And Ari's story, we could spend an hour just unpacking Ari's story of these traumas in his life and how it shut down his capacity to feel and how this use, and we said it at the beginning, we said it in the middle, we'll say it again at the end. We're not wholesale endorsing psychedelic use, certainly not in a non-supervised, indicated, medically mandated or controlled way. And we're simply trying to educate ourselves and others to have this discussion, to be open-minded and have our eyes open to, as medicine is embracing it, to consider it as a tool in the tool belt, as people can take advantage and use it to help them.
Correct. Yeah, and the courage, there's so many people that are going to identify with different parts of his story. And that's the goal. If you do find yourself identifying with different areas on some level, pick up the phone, call somebody, do some research yourself, reach out to either a RAV, a mental health professional, take the next steps because there's no reason to suffer for longer than you need to. And there are solutions out there. We have solutions within our community that understand what our profile looks like, our family systems. And that's the goal. The goal is that to have, help people understand that there's a solution, a roadmap to recovery around these issues.
And it's important we don't close this conversation without also stating, hopefully the obvious, that psychedelics, any drugs, any medicines, FDA approved or not, should never be taken unless they're needed and prescribed. And the notion that, you could use some of these very same substances recreationally or to party or to enjoy or to escape or to numb is not the Jewish way. It's not our value system. It's not what we believe. First of all, it's incredibly dangerous. We heard from the doctor about a terrible episode, but more in addition to that, reality is something that we embrace, that we lean into, that we make the most of, that we transform. We don't take shortcuts. We don't experience a counterfeit spirituality. We're supposed to do the hard work in life to be able to feel spirituality in order to feel, in order to grow, in order to engage the other modalities and the other therapies. So hopefully it doesn't need to be said or elaborated upon, but any drug use or any use of any medications shouldn't be done recreationally or for fun or to experiment or out of the context of a supervised, indicated environment.
Absolutely. Just like all treatment. And just continue to encourage people to come out of the shadows, to share it, don't fear it. And we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. And we have a lot more planned as far as different topics to really cover a broad, complex area of issues.
And please share with us your ideas, topics you want to hear, feedback on this episode. We'd love to hear from you. And we continue to express our gratitude to the Wine Pearls. And all of these conversations are in memory of Jonathan Wine Pearl. Moshe, you are a real partner, and I count among my blessings and things I'm grateful for our opportunity to work together on this project and others. So thank you so much.
Likewise, Feelings Mutual and the BRS community has been a host to our program, Onward Living, really giving the individuals struggling, navigating their recovery, a home, literally a home table to sit at, a community that's not judgmental, that understands that there are challenges. And despite that, with those challenges, we will embrace them. And it's such a beautiful partnership, Onward Living and the BRS community. So we feel equally as grateful and appreciate the relationship.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Out of the Shadows. To help bring the show to a wider audience, please rate and review on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe and find more episodes of Out of the Shadows on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. For further resources, be sure to check out the show notes.